Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents To Hell and Back, My Life in Johnny Thunder's Heartbreakers, in the words of the last man standing, by Walter Lure with Dave Thompson. Narrated by B.J. Harrison. Introduction. We were seated in Hell's Kitchen. That is, Richard Hell's Kitchen, as opposed to the once notorious New York City slum. In truth, however, there was probably little to choose between the two of them. Hell lived at the time on 12th Street, between Avenues A and B, the edge of Alphabet City, and the fringe of the East Village, too. I was never certain whether he chose the geography deliberately, but if he wanted to score drugs, any drugs, he could not have found a cooler location. Allen Ginsberg lived in one of the apartments upstairs. We used to see him coming up and down the stairs with very young pretty boys on his arm. It was a strange neighborhood for such a well-known figure to live in, down at the heels and sleazy beyond belief, but it suited him in a peculiar way. Plus, who knows how much money he actually made, or if he pissed it all away on drugs and sex. It's what most of his neighbors would have done, given the opportunity. That was not an issue for me. I knew that the Heartbreakers, the band that I had just joined, possessed a certain reputation. After all, Johnny Thunders, our guitarist, and Jerry Nolan, our drummer, were former New York Dolls, and carried all the cultural and chemical baggage that came with such membership. The rumor was it was Iggy Pop who turned Johnny onto smack in the first place, when the Dolls visited Los Angeles in 1973, but he'd scarcely been Mr. Clean Living before that. Even before the Dolls, he used to deal speed, which is how he made his money, but he probably took as much as he sold, and not only speed, uppers, downers, stay-in-the-middlers. It was said that Johnny devoured them all, even before he joined a band. Fame just gave him access to even more than he normally swallowed. Jerry, older than the rest of us, followed Johnny's lead on that score, which surprised me, because in most respects it was Johnny who looked up to Jerry. He was fascinated by 50s rock and roll, the music, the lifestyle, the culture, the lot. And to Johnny, Jerry epitomized that era, that first manic rush of teenage rebellion that finally posited an alternative to the white-bread picket fence world to which young America was supposed to aspire. Jerry was a good teacher, too. He was 6 years older than Johnny, 3 years older than Hell and I, and what he didn't know about rock and roll, real rock and roll, before the 60s diluted it down to pop, could be written on the tip of a needle, rather like the one that was lying on the table a few feet away. Initially, the plan was simply to give the new boy, me, a haircut. I had become a heartbreaker just days before. Since then, we'd played one gig and had a couple of rehearsals, and we'd be running through the songs again later today. But first, the haircut. Aside from Johnny, who still wore his old doll's mop with possessive pride, I had the longest locks in the band. Richard and Jerry both showed off their ears. Johnny barely revealed he had shoulders. I was somewhere in between, but the short hairs were adamant. The Heartbreakers had an image to build, street-fighting tough guys from the Lower East Side, and we weren't going to do that if we looked like hippies or glam rockers. Jerry, at some point in his storied career, had trained as a hairdresser. So, it transpired, had Dee Dee Ramone, whose own band had a lot less in common with him than we did. Years later, I heard rumors that Dee Dee's greatest wish had once been to become a heartbreaker. I don't know if it's true, and I doubt if it would have worked. But he was always around, and he was here today. In fact, I could hear him and Jerry conferring as they studied the challenge before them. How to make Walter look like a heartbreaker. I had no qualms. Say what you like about the band's reputation, that word again, but when it came to how they presented themselves on stage, they were deadly serious. That was Johnny and Jerry's doing, I think. You don't come out of the New York Dolls, and in Johnny's case, you didn't go into them either, without having an innate sense of style. And no matter how sour the Dolls' universe eventually became, they had never lost that. Times had changed, though. The Dolls had barely been in their grave 4 months. David Johansen and Sylvain had reanimated the name, but we'll get to that later. But already their old promo photos looked like creatures from another age. Glam was dead. Glamour was finished. The new wave of bands that emerged in the Dolls' wake, though grateful to the group for kicking down some doors, nevertheless opted for another look entirely. Not quite street clothes, because they remained too studied for that, but ripped jeans and leather jackets, torn T-shirts and shirtless suits. That was what the bands wore now. And though they probably still shopped at the same thrift stores and vintage marts, they usually stayed in the men's department. Maybe that's why the long hair had to go. I don't remember, if I was even aware, who made the first cut. I just sat there waiting as my tresses tumbled. Occasionally, one of them would speak. Too much? Not enough? That works. Finally, the deed was done. A mirror was procured, and I inspected their handiwork. It was a shock, but it was a good shock. I liked it. My mom would like it. My careers advisor back at school would have liked it. The guy who decked me in a bar back in 1966, for no reason aside from the fact I had long hair, would have liked it. Maybe. It might still have been a bit much for him, but for the Heartbreakers, it was perfect. I was about to tell them that, but they had already moved on. I'd had my initial induction into the band. Now it was time for my second. Also on the table, alongside the needle, was a spoon. Jerry held the needle, Dee Dee did the cooking, and I just rolled up my sleeve and stretched out my arm as Jerry tied it off. I had done heroin in the past, once or twice at college or thereabouts, just to see what it was like. It was okay. There was no fireworks, no flashing lights, no lurid neon signs proclaiming welcome. I did it, and that was it. I never felt the need again. This time, I wasn't quite so discerning. Like the haircut, getting high was a rite of passage that I needed to undertake as a member of the band. Although needed is the wrong word. It wasn't as if they said, you have to shoot up if you're going to join the Heartbreakers. But the way I looked at the situation was that I'd have to get into it sooner or later just to see what all the fuss was about. Which, of course, is a really stupid reason, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. It certainly didn't cross my mind that, having made that discovery, I would then spend the next 13 years exploring it, or that everything I would experience during that period, but especially through the lifespan of the Heartbreakers, would ultimately be refracted through the lens of my addiction. At the time, it was just what I did. Well, that, and play guitar. Chapter 1. From Floral Park to the Fillmore. Walter Lure is living proof of Jerry Lewis's influence on rock and roll. On stage, he alternates between jerking about like an out-of-control puppet, only to go suddenly rigid and belt out chord upon chord that were predestined to activate your feet. So declared journalist Pete Makowski in the British music paper Sounds, in the issue dated June 4th, 1977. And of all the words that have been written about my music over the years, these are some of my favorites. For a start, it's funny. Lots of musicians have been compared to Jerry Lee Lewis, but Jerry No Lee Lewis? That has to be a first. It was written at the peak of the Heartbreakers' year and a bit in the United Kingdom. Late 1976, through spring 1978. And I still remember the pride I felt when I read it, and the smirk that crossed my face as I flicked through that week's music papers in our apartment in Pimlico, London. But do you want to know a secret? I never intended to be a guitarist. Never wanted to. I took lessons when I was 12 or 13, inspired no doubt by hearing the Ventures on the radio. But I can't say my heart was in it. It was just something to do. And having done it, I stopped. Music meant little to me at the time, although that's not to say I wasn't interested. The late 1950s and early 1960s were the era of the great teen dance programs, the big national shows that everyone has heard of, American Bandstand, things like that. But also a lot that seemed to have been forgotten now. The $64,000 Question, which often had musical guests. Herb Sheldon's Studio Party. The Sandy Becker Show, which was a puppet show, but was where I heard Ray Charles's Busted for the first time, sung by two puppets. And Disco Teen, hosted by John Zachary, the Cool Ghoul, a broadcast out of Newark, New Jersey. In fact, once I went to see an episode of Disco Teen being filmed, and when I watched it on television a few nights later, there I was, standing by the side of the stage. I followed these shows religiously. Home from school, switch on the television. That was my routine. It wasn't only music, either. There were a lot of shows I liked. Everything from The Honeymooners, which seemed to have been a favorite with almost every musician I went on to work with, to Howdy Doody. In fact, my mother took me to New York to watch the filming of both of those shows as well, and I remember how shocked I was to discover that the comfortable, well-appointed home that Ralph and Alice seemed to inhabit was, in fact, nothing more than an open space with an audience out front, the crew all around, 2 painted cardboard walls, and no ceiling to speak of. Ah, the wonders of television. Back to the music, though. I didn't have a radio at the time, not of my own. Transistors were around, but they were still expensive, and of course I was too young to drive, so shows like these became my jukebox. A lot of the music that I liked came from those TV programs, and while much of it was very straightforward pop, Gary U.S. Bonds was probably the blackest singer I ever heard, there was enough good stuff to keep me happy. Plus, I'd get to see all the new dances, and that was important, because that's when I started to get into dancing and parties and stuff like that. Before that, I thought dancing meant standing there and shaking. Those shows taught me a different perspective. So although the music scene was still full of passing pop stars and watered-down Elvis, Brill Building ballads and Sealed with a Kiss, I'd buy the latest 45s and take them to parties to dance to, or make out to in the dark. It was wallpaper, really, and that's how I viewed my guitar lessons. They were something to do, but they were scarcely life-changing. Of course, it might have helped if the lessons themselves had been a little more inspiring. My teacher was some middle-aged guy who worked out of a music store near my home, giving lessons in the back room. And the first tune I was given to learn was She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain, which might be a popular standard, but hardly sets the heartbeat racing. I don't remember many lessons I took, but it wasn't many. If we fast-forward 5 or 6 years to 1967 or 1968, however, my ambitions were considerably more pronounced. Now I was in my freshman year, studying chemistry at Fordham University in the Bronx. My older brother, William, was into his last year at the same establishment, but we rarely socialized. I had a gaggle of friends my own age, including the students with whom I carpooled every morning, and music was the only thing we talked about, more or less. A few of them already played guitar, and when I first picked up the instrument again, it was so I could join in the jams that most of our evenings together faded into. The difference is, I never put it down again. I didn't take lessons either. I let my younger brother Richie do that. He'd come home from the tutor, show me what he'd learned that day, and you can bet it wasn't "She'll be comin' round the mountain" and "Mary had a little lamb." My first notes, my first chords, my first songs. Richard showed me all of them. And the fact that he was 6 years younger than I was didn't matter at all. In fact, it probably helped. It meant that we could learn together. I took the instrument seriously, both the rudiments that Richie taught me and those I was learning to discover for myself, listening to records until I'd worn them out, focusing on what the guitar was doing, trying to figure out how Jeff Beck got this sound and Pete Townsend got that one, flicking through the pages of whichever magazine was on hand, seeing which guitarist played which guitar. I'd go to shows and perch myself as close to the guitarist as I could, to watch every move he made. For a couple of years I was practicing 2 or 3 hours a day. Even after I graduated college and went to work, I'd come home and lock myself away, playing records and my guitar. I've always prided myself on a certain degree of dedication. If I set my mind to do something, I want to do it well. 10 years later, I suppose, you could say I did it with smack. 10 years after that, I did it on Wall Street. Right now, I was doing it on guitar. What brought about the change? Why was I suddenly devoted to an instrument that I had hitherto thrown to one side? It's simple. It was the Beatles. But not the Beatles themselves. They were great. But I was only a die-hard fan for a few months. It was what they made possible that made the difference to me. As far as I was concerned, the Beatles were like the Dolls in a lot of ways. They kicked down doors that had previously been closed and invited everyone else to come pouring through. The difference, of course, is that the Dolls sat back and watched everyone pass them. The Beatles ran on ahead. It's difficult to explain just what a wasteland pop music was before the Beatles came along, if only because so many of the records from that era are so firmly entrenched as golden oldies that people forget how much they disliked them at the time. I had a few favorites. The Contours' "Do You Love Me" was a great record, and a lot of the Phil Spector things were terrific. But as I said before, music was a recreational thing. You'd go to a party and they'd play things you liked, people like Gary U.S. Bonds, and then the Beach Boys popped up and they'd play things you didn't like. I liked some older stuff as well. Like Jerry Nolan, my brother William had musical tastes forged in the crucible of rock and roll's first flowering. And growing up listening to the records he was playing, I liked a lot of it well enough. But it never spoke to me. If anything, I preferred the kind of music our father enjoyed listening to. He loved Broadway musicals. And when we were growing up, a musical was the soundtrack to every Saturday morning when my parents were cleaning house. Oklahoma, My Fair Lady, all that Rodgers and Hammerstein stuff. The King and I. And Dad didn't play them quietly either. If anyone ever asks me where my love of loud music came from, I tell them that I can still hear those things blasting the shit out of the house. So it was only when the Beatles came along that music stopped being background noise and became a lifestyle. And then the Rolling Stones came along, and that was what changed my perspective on pop. The first time I heard them, I was sold for life. Then came the British invasion. That unparalleled 2 or 3 year span during which every new record you heard seemed light years from the past, and every fresh English import felt a little more outrageous or unusual than ever. The Beatles, with their long hair, the Stones, with even longer locks, the Pretty Things, who looked practically female when they first appeared. Dylan, not a Briton or an invader, of course, but he learned from them, and they learned from him, with a nasal twang that no one over 30 would even dream of describing as singing, questioning everything we'd been taught to accept. The Kinks, the Zombies, the Who, the lot. No longer the soundtrack to a teenage makeout party, music had transformed itself into an ongoing conversation between artist and audience, and its words spoke directly to anyone who listened. It was a whole new dynamic. You didn't just play records to have something to dance to any longer. You listened to the lyrics and the playing. I started obsessing on the Stones, and when I got to college, of course, the place was filled with like-minded people. The center of our universe was the college music room, which was where they conducted music lessons, and which was dominated by the most enormous stereo system I had ever seen. There was a little alcove at the side where you put the records on, but the music came through these enormous speakers, so it was a great place to listen. When I first got there, that alcove was the preserve of the jazz and classical brigade, and the records I'd want to hear were few and far between. Nevertheless, my friends and I were in there as often as we could be. We'd make requests, we'd complain about records we didn't like, and gradually we made our way into the midst of things until ultimately we were the people in the booth. There was a group of us, and maybe 2 or 3 others, a couple of Spanish guys, I remember. We took over, and we'd be playing the new albums that came out, the Beatles, the Stones, the Kinks, all the British invasion bands as they developed into the musical giants they became. We were not a wholly exclusive coterie. Every so often a newcomer would enter the room and impress us with either his knowledge of music or his taste. The late Albert Ski, for instance. Over the next few years, close to a decade in fact, Albert would rank among my greatest friends. But the first time I met him, he was this kid from Bensonhurst, 2 or 3 years behind me, who would just stand around listening. He was a good-looking kid, with long hair and all the new records. He made friends with everyone, and soon he was joining us in the control booth, helping select the music we'd play, and intriguing me even further when he let on that he was a bass player. A couple of the other guys had musical ambitions, but Albert really seemed to know what he was talking about. Soon we were hanging out together as much as we could. Of course, other people would bring in new records as they came out. The first California groups, Midwest garage bands, scoring their one and only hit, all of that. There was also a little contingent, 2 Italian kids and a Spanish guy who were the very first junkies I ever met. They liked very different music than we did as well, so there was a little bit of friction, although it never got out of control. We used to refer to it as the junkies versus the acid heads. But we were the ones who controlled it, so if we didn't like a record, we'd simply refuse to play it. And that's where I got to meet all the different people who played in bands. Every spare dollar I had was spent on records. Everything the Rolling Stones put out, most of the Beatles, a lot of everything else. At home, I'd play them to my brother Richie, because despite the age difference, he grew up on the same bands as I did, just at a later point in their career. I discovered the Stones with Not Fade Away, and that moodily jacketed debut album. He found them for Jumping Jack Flash and Beggar's Banquet, and you can bet I encouraged the discovery. I encouraged his guitar lessons as well. Or I'd go over to Albert's house to listen with him, and all the while talking about the music, what it really meant, what it really said, and how great it would be to go to England, where everyone, we imagined, looked and dressed and talked exactly like this. I grew my hair out, and even that was an act of rebellion, whether I realized the fact or not. My parents put up with it. Like so many, I'd imagine, they decided it was just a phase, and I'd come to my short-haired senses soon enough. For instance, occasionally neighbors would tell my mother, "Oh, Walter looks awful with long hair," but she'd just tell them, "He does what he likes." My father was less tolerant, however. My brothers and I didn't yet have cars of our own, so we had to use Dad's. Every so often, though, he'd get pissed off about my hair and other things, and refuse to let me use the car. In fact, he'd grab the keys and go out to sit in the car himself. That was as far as he would take his disapproval, though. The one time he did kick me out of the house because of my hair, my mother refused to cook his dinner until he let me back in. And if I tried to win him over to my way of thinking by showing him pictures of George Washington and Andrew Jackson with their hair down to their shoulders, he'd say, "Oh, that was the old days." "The good old days," I'd reply. Out in the wider world, however, I quickly grew accustomed to hearing shouts or whistles from people I passed, that older generation, to whom anything more flamboyant than a regulation buzz cut was just another symptom of the death of decorum, decency, and civilized society. Most people were happy to leave it at that. An insult hurled from a passing car. "Get your hair cut," from an old man in a store. "Hello, ma'am," from a witty builder. One night in a bar with a friend from high school, however, I discovered just how far some people were prepared to go to make their disapproval known. In truth, my hair really wasn't that bad. It was just beginning to get long, and I doubt it was even past my ears at the time. And we were just sitting, talking, minding our own business, when this guy simply marched up to me and punched me in the face. One blow, and he knocked out half of one of my front teeth. I still have a partial cap there. My friend jumped out of the seats to try and grab him, and the bartender threw the guy out. She also gave me a free beer. And I was still sitting there wondering, what the fuck? And the fuck was, I had long hair. That's why he hit me. I saw exactly the same thing 10 years later, when flying into London the night that the Sex Pistols swore on TV, and one of the newspapers reported on the lorry driver who was so disgusted that he kicked in his screen. It was the gut reaction of the gutless moron. He couldn't confront the offense in person, and probably wouldn't have dared if he could. But an innocent bystander, be it TV screen or skinny high school kid, that was a different matter entirely. Bam! In a way, though, you could understand the older generation's disquiet. Overnight, everything that the average American teenager had been brought up to expect from life, or more pertinently, everything life expected from the average American teenager, had been rewritten. Particularly if you grew up, as I did, in what was effectively suburbia. My mother, Eileen, was Irish, and one of 7 kids, 2 boys and 5 girls. My father, who was also named Walter, was half Irish, half German, hence the family name Lure. I changed the spelling when I joined the Heartbreakers. And one of 4 children, 2 sisters and a brother who died at the Battle of the Bulge. He worked as a retail banker, and home, until I was 10, was Queens Village in East Queens, New York. Very residential, very middle class. Large detached homes, big yards, long driveways. Later, in 1959, we moved to Floral Park, which was even more exclusive. But it was just as buttoned up when it came to freaks and hippies. The only real difference was that instead of yelling at you when you passed them, people would tut under their breath. Shouldn't be allowed, tut-tut. My family was Catholic, very Catholic, and my upbringing followed suit. I was born in St. Mary Immaculate in Jamaica, Queens on April 22nd, 1949. My first school was St. Joachim and Anne Grammar, and after we moved to Floral Park, I transferred to St. Hedwig's, a largely Polish grammar school whose nuns did their best to teach me their native language, although I've forgotten most of it. From there I graduated to St. Mary's Boys' High School, and the not particularly tender mercies of a band of religious brothers who thought nothing of smacking us around if they decided we were misbehaving. None of which sounds especially remarkable, but that's because I don't think I was an exceptionally remarkable kid.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?